Protests in Iran are seriously escalating over these last couple of days, really over the course of the last 24, 48 hours. They've really ramped up. And when this whole thing started about a little less than 2 weeks ago, President Trump put out a Truth Social post, put out a tweet saying that he would punish the Iranian regime if they started firing on protesters. And the other day on Hugh Hewitt's program, he reiterated this threat. Have a look.
47-year tyranny.
Well, I don't want to say it, but I will tell you they're not doing well, as you know, probably better than anybody. They're doing very poorly. And I have let them know that if they start killing people, which they tend to do during their riots, they have lots of riots. If they do it, we're going to hit them very hard.
Now, dozens have been killed. I know you don't do red lines, but have you communicated to them what that limit of your patience is?
Well, some have been killed by problems of crowd control and other things. And we're watching it very closely. The crowds are so large, there's been a stampede. There's been 3 stampedes, and people have been killed in that, and I'm not sure I can necessarily hold somebody responsible for that. But they know, and they've been told very strongly, even more strongly than I'm speaking to you right now, that if they do that, they're going to have to pay hell.
Do you have a message for the people of Iran, President Trump?
All I can say is you should feel strongly about freedom. There's nothing like freedom. You're brave people. It's a shame what's happened to your country. Your country was a great country. I remember years ago when I was a young real estate developer, friends of mine went to Iran and they did great. They built buildings in Iran. They're still up, barely, by the way, but they're still up. I see pictures of them, apartment houses, and they did very well in Iran. They've passed away. They were very successful developers. They were great people, mostly New York developers, but they went to Iran and they built some pretty good jobs in Iran. And I remember they were saying the people are great. The whole place was great. It was a tremendous market.
Yeah, so here's President Trump kind of hedging and saying that, of course, we're going to punish the regime if they start killing people. But then when Hugh Hewitt asked him about the dozens of people who've been killed, he said, well, a lot of them have been killed by crowd control because, of course, he doesn't necessarily want to step in and start having American military action against the Iranian regime. But the threat is still hanging over their heads, and he is supporting the people. And this is a huge change from the way Barack Obama behaved when there were protests in the streets of Iran during his time in office. And, when he kind of said, oh, we'll just let things play out. And we're not going to intervene in the in Iranian domestic issues, which, of course, let the protesters hang out to dry. Now, he also pointed out there that the Iranian economy is a great place to do business, that he had friends who built buildings there, and the Iranian people are great people. I just want to drill down on this point a little bit. People sitting far away in the West, you look over here in the Middle East, and you kind of think of everyone here being the same, all of these Muslim countries. Iran is not an Arab country. They're Persians. They're different culturally. They're actually not that Islamic at all. In fact, Iran reportedly has the lowest percentage of mosque attendance of any Islamic country. It's actually a pretty secular, fairly educated population. Think back to before the Iranian Revolution, before 1979, there were regular flights between Tel Aviv and Tehran. Again, a very pro-Western, very secular population. So this isn't a situation like Libya or Iraq or Syria or, one of these, kind of chaotic Arab states that if the regime falls, you're going to have all these, Islamic militias firing at each other. You don't have that. You don't have that in Iran. It's actually a pretty pro-Western society. And that could mean that the fall of the Iranian regime could lead to an ally of the West. We'll talk about that more in a little bit, but I want to show you what's actually going on the ground because things are getting pretty hairy. So here, take a look. Video shows crowds in northern Iran's Rasht neighborhood, and they are attacking a Basij headquarters. Basij is the police that are meant to put down the riot. And here you have the people attacking the Basij. And this is a type of violence that we didn't see in protests in past go-arounds over the last few decades. So things are definitely getting more violent. We're also seeing much bigger numbers. This is a crowd shot from the protests from yesterday, and you see how massive the crowds are getting. Now, this is significant because in the first week and a half of this, the big flaw in these protests was that they weren't that big. They weren't as big as the protests that we saw a few years ago when there was this girl who was killed in custody for not wearing her hijab, and there were big protests then. We didn't see crowds of that size yet until yesterday. It's also significant because these crowds came out after a call by Reza Pahlavi, the crown prince of Iran, who was in exile, and he called for massive crowds to come out. Another development that we're seeing that we didn't see in earlier rounds of protests is the death of IRGC personnel. The protesters are actually killing people from the regime, and that's something that we never saw in the past, and that really marks a significant change. Now, what we haven't seen yet is mass defections from the IRGC, and we still would want to see that to know that the regime is actually falling. Which brings us to what the regime is doing. So the regime, according to this report here, they have shut down the internet and shut down phone service so that it's more difficult for footage to get out and for the protesters to communicate with each other. But Elon Musk has reportedly stepped in to help the protesters and given them the Starlink capability. So things are escalating there. There are protesters being killed. Reportedly, 45 protesters have been killed as of that last report. And everyone's watching to see what President Trump is going to do. Now, I want to pull back the camera and talk about what to look for down the road. So if the regime starts really getting more and more violent and shooting at protesters more and more, while this is obviously a tragedy, it doesn't mean that the protests are failing and that the regime is stronger. It actually is a sign of weakness because it will make it will increase the likelihood of more rebellion down the road. It will not help the regime in these protests long term. If they're killing a lot of protesters, it could also invite intervention by the West, specifically President Trump fulfilling his threats. I believe that the worst case scenario that we could see in these protests is actually something that looks like regime change, but isn't really regime change. In other words, let's say you have like the second tier leadership or like the military leaders would step in, overthrow the top level guys, overthrow the mullahs, and say, we're not like them. We're not enforcing the Islamic stuff. We're turning on the regime. This is regime change. And we're also, bureaucrats who know how to run things because we've been running things for years. And the West might buy that because President Trump and other Western leaders, what they really want more than anything else is stability and quiet. And if you have a bunch of bureaucrats, these mobsters, these criminals who've been running the Iranian regime for years, who would have an internal coup at the top and say that they're not part of the regime anymore and there's been regime change and they're more moderate and more pro-Western, but really they would just continue to oppress the people. And you'd have a kind of military dictatorship replace the Islamic dictatorship that you have now. That to me is the worst case scenario because it would make it much more difficult for regime change, real regime change to happen. So that to me is the worst case scenario for us to look for down the road. And I also want to make a comment about the strategic importance of Iran. The Iranian regime is close allies with the Chinese Communist Party. Back in 2021, they signed a 25-year cooperation agreement. The Iranians sell much of their oil to the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese, in turn, of course, provide a lot of the funding for the Iranians, but also provide the Iranians with weaponry. They sell them airplanes and they help with their ballistic missile program and their air defenses. So the Iranians depend on the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party depends on the Iranians, and they're all part of this three-way axis of evil between the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese. If the Iranian regime falls and Iran becomes aligned with the West, which is a distinct possibility here, the big loser in all of this is the Chinese Communist Party. And it means that America's position vis-a-vis the Chinese Communist Party is greatly enhanced, greatly strengthened. This makes Taiwan safer. And it really changes the geopolitics of the whole world. So this isn't just an issue of the Middle East. Now, it's not certain that the regime is going to fall. A lot can still happen in the coming days. And we're going to be watching this situation, obviously, very, very closely. So stay tuned to this channel.